Mr. President of the Cambridge African Society, Ms. Michelle Adebe, Chair of the Africa Together Conference, distinguished representatives of the University of Cambridge, faculty members and students, members of the African diaspora present here today, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, before I speak as President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, please permit me first to speak as a man that has been shaped by the great continent of Africa. I grew up in Sierra Leone at a time when the promises of independence still felt young, and the fragility beneath them was not yet fully visible. I was a young soldier when the Civil War tore my country apart. I watched institutions collapse. I watched neighbors become enemies. I watched a nation with every reason to thrive nearly cease to exist. But I also witnessed something extraordinary. I saw ordinary Sierra Leoneans, market women, teachers, farmers, young men and women with little except dignity and resilience refuse to surrender the idea of their country. They held on to the institutions that failed. They rebuilt it, and leadership when leadership had failed them. That experience did not make me cynical about Africa at all. It convinced me that the difference between nations consumed by crisis and nations that survive it is not simply resources or geography. It is the quality of the institutions, the resilience of the citizens, and the clarity of leadership. Everything I will say here today will flow from that conviction, ladies and gentlemen. Because the defining question before Africa today is not whether disruption exists. It is here, as we all know. It is whether Africa will respond to disruption with dependence or with agency, with reaction or with strategic choice. And there are few places more important to this conversation than universities, because this is where the future is debated before even it arrives. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm deeply conscious of where I stand tonight. The University of Cambridge, one of the world's greatest intellectual institutions of learning. It has shaped science, politics, economics, philosophy, and global thoughts for centuries. It has also shaped Africa's story. Many African leaders and thinkers who fought for independence passed through institutions like this. Yet, institutions connected to the empire were also part of the structures that disrupted African governance, extracted African wealth, and shaped political realities whose consequences remain with us to date. I raise this not to assign blame at all, because there is enough to go around, but because serious partnership requires historical honesty. The relationship between Africa and institutions like Cambridge must now evolve beyond old assumptions, not as patron and subject, but as genuine intellectual partners with a shared stake in humanity's future. Antonio Gramsci once observed, and I quote, "The world is dying, and the old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born." End of quote. So much of what we are now calling disruption is actually humanity living in that transition. And universities such as Cambridge carry a profound responsibility during moments like these. Ideas developed in places like this have shaped nations, transformed economies, and altered the direction of civilization itself. That is why this conversation matters, because Africa's choices in this century will shape far more than Africa alone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living through an era in which disruption has become the defining condition of global affairs. Technology is advancing faster than governance systems can adapt. Artificial intelligence is reshaping economies, labor markets, warfare, and even the nature of truth itself. Climate change is redefining food security, migration, and human survival. Geopolitical tensions are fragmenting the international order. The old assumptions of stability no longer hold. The world is being reordered before our face. So for Africa, the defining question is no longer whether disruption will affect us. It already has. The real question is whether Africa will simply experience disruption or strategically shape the age emerging from it. Will Africa remain an arena where global powers compete for influence? Or will Africa become an actor with the confidence and strategic clarity to shape outcomes itself? That is the deeper meaning of this conference theme. Africa and the age of disruption, power, agency, and strategic choice. Because in this century, power increasingly belongs to societies that can adapt quickly, innovate intelligently, and act strategically. Agency is the capacity to define priorities independently and protect national interests with clarity. And strategic choice is what transforms potential into influence. Africa's greatest risk is not disruption itself, in my view. It is entering an age of disruption without strategic agency. Yet, disruption does not automatically produce decline. For societies with vision, disruption can become an opening for strategic emergence. So, ladies and gentlemen, as President of Sierra Leone and Chairman of the ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government, I can say with certainty that disruption is no longer theoretical for Africa. In West Africa today, we are confronting democratic fragility, unconstitutional changes of government, violent extremism, disinformation, economic shocks, and climate insecurity. The struggle for constitutional order in West Africa is not separate from the age of disruption. It is one of the clearest manifestations of disruption. When democratic legitimacy weakens, instability expands. When institutions lose public trust, extremism fills the vacuum. These challenges cannot be addressed through reaction alone. They require strategic leadership, institutional resilience, and regional cooperation grounded in legitimacy and public trust. Because for me, legitimacy is now one of the most important forms of strategic power. Legitimacy. And if I may speak a little personally for a moment, let me say this, that I learned something very early in public life. I was only 29 when I joined the leadership of my nation through a military coup. I learned something very early at that time. Power is easiest to seize when institutions are weak. But history also taught me that the truest test of leadership is not the ability to take power. It is the discipline to submit power to constitutional order. In 1996, during one of the darkest periods in our country's history, I decided I was going to spearhead the transition from military rule back to democratic governance after nearly 3 decades of autocratic rule. That experience shaped my understanding of leadership permanently. I learned that coups may simplify power temporarily, but they destroy legitimacy. I learned that military command cannot substitute for democratic consent. And I learned that the hardest act of leadership is not taking power, it is limiting it. Ladies and gentlemen, so when I became a Democrat and came to office in 2018, Sierra Leone was emerging from years of crisis and institutional fragility and underinvestment. We faced a fundamental choice. Do we wait for ideal conditions before investing in our people? Or do we invest in our people to transform those conditions? We chose the latter. We abolished school fees and launched the free quality education program because we understood then and still understand that no nation can rise sustainably while millions of its children remain excluded from opportunity. Today, more than 1 million children, additional children, are in school. We expanded healthcare services, strengthened maternal and child health systems, and invested deliberately in more resilient public health sector. We prioritize women's empowerment through the progressive reforms and expanded opportunities for girls and women. Because no society can fully develop while half of its population is left behind. We also launched the Feed Salon program to strengthen food security and agricultural productivity. We invested in technology, infrastructure, youth employment, and public service reforms, recognizing that sustainable transformation requires both human capability and institutional strength. None of this work is complete, but the direction is clear, the new direction. In an age of disruption, human capital must become Africa's primary engine of resilience and competitiveness. Human capital development is therefore not a social expenditure. It is Africa's most strategic long-term investment. But honesty also demands accountability. We African leaders cannot speak only about external injustice while ignoring internal responsibility. Corruption remains a serious challenge across parts of our continent. Democratic backsliding is real. And institutions weakened for political convenience ultimately weaken nations themselves. If Africa is to demand fairness and respect globally, we African leaders must also remain accountable to our African citizens. Because a continent that seeks global respect must also uphold integrity, transparency, and constitutional responsibility at home. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa possesses extraordinary strategic assets. We are home to the world's youngest population, and we hold critical minerals essential for global energy transition. We possess vast agricultural potential, entrepreneurial energy, cultural influence, and immense human capital. But history teaches us that potential alone does not produce power. Resources without strategy often enrich others more than ourselves. The challenge before Africa is therefore not whether we matter, we already do, and we know that. The challenge is whether we can convert relevance to leverage. Whether we can transform assets into strategic influence. And whether we can act collectively enough to shape outcomes rather than merely absorb them. Every disruption creates pressure. It also creates strategic choices. And history remembers the societies that choose wisely. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa possesses another strategic resource that is often overlooked. The wisdom of those who carried this continent through independence, conflict, and recovery, and even transformation are important. The energy of our young generation determined to build something together is even better. Wisdom without energy stagnates. Energy without wisdom can destroy. But wisdom and energy working in sync, that is how civilizations advance. Our elders must not only be honored, they must be consulted. Our youth must not only be celebrated, they must be empowered. Because continuity of vision across generations is itself a form of strategic power. And many of the future leaders of Africa And many of the future leaders shaping Africa from outside the continent are sitting in rooms like this tonight. The question before this generation is not whether the world is changing. It's whether you have the courage to shape that change intentionally. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to briefly identify 3 strategic arenas that will shape Africa's future. First, technology and digital sovereignty. Power today increasingly resides in code, data, platforms, and artificial intelligence. AI may become one of the most consequential forces shaping this century. The revolution is civilizational. It is redefining power, labor, governance, and even the nature of truth itself. Africa therefore faces a profound strategic choice. Will we participate in the AI revolution primarily as consumers of technologies designed elsewhere? Or will we help shape the systems and standards that define the future of global order? If Africa remains only a consumer of artificial intelligence, we risk reproducing digitally the same extractive relationships that characterized earlier economic eras. AI is also reshaping the information environment upon which democracy itself depends. Disinformation, synthetic media, and algorithmic manipulation now possess the capacity to undermine public trust and weaken democratic institutions. Yet I remain optimistic. Across this continent, young Africans are already innovating in fintech, digital health, agriculture, education technology, and artificial intelligence itself. Africa's challenge is not talent. It is scale, investment, and strategic coordination. We must invest in digital literacy, research institutions, ethical governance, and innovation ecosystems that position Africa not only as users of technology, but as creators and co-owners. Because societies absent from the writing of technological rules eventually find themselves governed by rules written by others. Africa must not only adapt to the future of artificial intelligence, Africa must help shape it. The second is economic transformation. Africa cannot industrialize its future using extractive models inherited from the past. We cannot continue exporting raw material and importing finished products. Value addition must replace extraction. Regional integration must become a practical economic architecture, not merely a political aspiration. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area presents enormous possibilities for that. But possibility alone is insufficient without implementation and political will. Third is climate change and resilience. Africa contributes the least to global emissions, yet suffers disproportionately from climate shocks. This is moral injustice. But strategic leadership transforms vulnerability into leverage. Africa possesses renewable energy potential, critical minerals, and agricultural resources that will shape the future of global economy. We must therefore help shape the global climate agenda, not simply appeal to it, because disruption punishes delay. Disruption punishes delay. And in strategic affairs, indecision itself is a decision. Ladies and gentlemen, no conversation about Africa's future can ignore the question of women's leadership and participation. Africa cannot claim strategic capacity while marginalizing half of its population from governance, from the economy, and decision-making institutions. That is a moral and strategic issue. The women of Africa are not waiting to be empowered. They are powerful. What they require is the removal of structural barriers that prevent them from participation. And that same truth applies to our youth. No continent can speak credibly about agency while excluding its young people from shaping the future that they will inherit. That is not fair. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa needs intellectual ecosystem capable of confronting complexity without surrendering to cynicism. We need leaders who understand that knowledge itself is strategic power. And this places particular responsibility on the African diaspora, especially scholars, innovators, researchers, and professionals shaped by institutions such as Cambridge. You are not outside Africa's future. You are part of its strategic capacity. Your responsibility is not simply to interpret Africa to the world. It is to help connect African knowledge to African transformation. Africa does not ask for charity of thought. Africa asks for seriousness of engagement. Africa should not only be studied by the world. Africa must increasingly become a source of ideas that help shape the world itself. Before I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to leave this room with 3 requests. 1, to the University of Cambridge, deepen partnership with African universities, not as benefactors, but as co-creators of knowledge. Support research shaped by African priorities and African realities. To the African diaspora, I say, your skills, your networks, your capital, and your credibility are among Africa's most underutilized strategic assets. Help build bridges that will carry knowledge, investment, mentorship, and opportunities back to the continent. And to the international community, Africa does not need more declarations without implementation. Africa needs debt restructuring that is real, climate finance that is delivered. Trade arrangements that reward value addition rather than raw extraction. And a genuine seat also at the table where the rules of global economy are written. We want to sit there. These are the requests made not from weakness. They are demands made from clarity. Because Africa is no longer asking simply to be included in the future. Africa is asking and preparing to help shape that future. Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I will conclude with this thought. In many African traditions, as we all know, or may know, communities gather around fire. The elders sit close to the flame because they have tended it longest. The young people gather around the edges, learning, preparing, and eventually inheriting responsibility for carrying the flame forward. That fire is more than just warmth. It is continuity, it is memory, it is wisdom, it is identity and shared purpose passed from one generation to the next. In this century, disruption is not simply wind around the fire. It is a force powerful enough to scatter the embers entirely. And so, in this age of disruption, I say the central question before Africa is ultimately a question of power, agency, and strategic choice. Do we possess the wisdom to tend the fire, the courage to carry it forward? And that is for the young people. And the foresight to pass it on brighter than we received it? That is the question for the young generation. History is already moving. The question is whether Africa will move as an author or an observer. Whether we will merely inherit disruption or shape what comes after it. Because the future will not belong only to the powerful. It will belong to those who can organize power intelligently, exercise agency confidently, and make strategic choices deliberately. And if Africa chooses wisely, the age of disruption may yet become Africa's age of strategic emergence. Cambridge has long taught the world how to question. Perhaps this generation now has the opportunity to show the world that Africa has also learned to choose, to act, and to build. To the young generation, I say to you, tend the fire, carry it forward, and never let it go out. Thank you.